The Second World War. For 6 years, Britain faced the fight of its life. This was a total war, and it reached every corner of Britain and British life. I'm Arthur Williams, a pilot and former Royal Marine who is fascinated by the Second World War. In this series, I'm going to travel the length and breadth of Britain to discover the places and people who helped us win the war. I'll walk the paths and byways to get a different perspective and make some fascinating discoveries. I'll uncover some of Britain's finest moments, as well as some that we'd sooner forget. This time, I'm in the northwest. There really is no substitute for coming and physically seeing the location yourself. I'm here to explore how two coastal spots played very different roles in keeping Britain going. Liverpool, which was on the front line of the Battle of the Atlantic.
And Winston Churchill himself, the only thing he really ever feared was the U-boats.
And the coastal resort of Blackpool that kept people's spirits up.
Really did cement Blackpool's position as an entertainment capital of Britain.
And kept us fighting. Components for Wellington bombers were manufactured in here. Before I came to Liverpool, I did a little bit of research about the Blitz here, and I found this photograph of the Victoria Memorial behind me and the area and just how flattened it is. If you have a look, it's completely devastated. But it's hard from the photograph to get a sense of the scale of destruction. So sitting here now, I can roughly see that with Queen Victoria facing down there, this area would have been absolutely flattened. And it must have been a huge area, and it is. As you're here, Victoria's sort of facing down that way, and so therefore, these little avenues and streets must have been here. You know, there's nothing there. They're massive buildings now. And they say that a picture paints 1,000 words, but there's no substitute for coming and physically seeing a location yourself. Just gives you an idea of what they were having to deal with during those dark years in the 1940s, during the Second World War. On this walk, I'll discover how the people of the Northwest battled to keep Britain's war machine going. Starting in Liverpool, I'll travel from the docks that made the city so important to a church that demonstrates how badly the city was bombed. I'll visit a secret building that was at the centre of the war effort. And crisscross the city to learn how the Chinese community played a pivotal role. And I'll be heading to Blackpool, where war-weary Brits could get a sense of normality. My walk kicks off here in Liverpool, Britain's wartime powerhouse, which was not only a hive of industry, but vital to keeping Britain supplied with armaments and food. Wandering around the docks today, it's very difficult to imagine just how different this place would have been during the Second World War. Well, for one, it would have been mad busy. A very dirty place too, I'd imagine. But just to give you some idea of the scale of what was happening here, that during the 6-year period of the Second World War, 1/3 of all of Britain's imports came through this dock. That equates to 75 million tonnes of imports. Such was Liverpool's importance that it became a prime target for Hitler, and with the exception of London, no British city was bombed more. The first raid on Liverpool was as early as August 1940, weeks before the London Blitz had even begun. Over the next 8 months, the Luftwaffe struck targets in Liverpool, Birkenhead, Bootle and Wallasey. But to Hitler's frustration, the Merseysiders were defiant, and so in May 1941, he set out to crush Liverpool once and for all. I'm on my way to the first main stop of my walk, to a place that truly felt the brunt of the air raids. On the 1st of May 1941, Air raid sirens began to ring out across the city. The Luftwaffe were coming, and they continued to come every evening for the next week. In total, they would drop 870 tons of high explosive bombs and more than 112,000 incendiary devices. The May Blitz proved to be the most sustained period of bombing of Liverpool's war. On the penultimate day of the week-long assault, St Luke's Church took a direct hit. The Georgian Gothic building had taken 18 years to construct, but in the space of one night, it became nothing more than a burnt-out shell. Chris, this building that we're in, there's an old bombed-out church. What happened?
Well, I was right in the middle of the May Blitz. It was like 7 days of constant bombing for Liverpool by the Luftwaffe. And on the 6th of May, the church was hit by an incendiary device. So the way that the incendiary devices worked was when they hit the ground, they split open, obviously. They're thermite. And it'd take 2 minutes, maybe a bit longer, to completely ignite. And when they ignited, they'd explode and throw flaming bits of thermite around. This probably hit by multiple because they dropped them in the thousands at the time. It just caused a firestorm inside the church. We know it was hit around midnight, maybe just after midnight, and we know the fire reached its peak because up there there's the clocks on the clock tower. Yeah. The clock actually stopped 3:36 in the morning. Yeah, the fire was so intense that it caused the bells, 5 bells, to fall. Wow. From the tower. The ideas were originally to repair it. It says it was a working church, but there was no money after the war. So they thought about it and they decided to leave it as a memorial to those who lived and died through the Blitz.
Why was Liverpool important as a target?
90% of all cargo coming into the UK came up the River Mersey. And if you can imagine what was coming into the city, I think over the course of the war, something like 75 million tonnes was brought into the port.
Yeah, you forget about these other cities that were just as important targets to the Germans as London.
Well, at the height of it, we had something like 60 convoys coming in a week. And in some cases, there are stories of the dockers actually working through air raids with bombs going off all around them. So the convoys were coming in constantly. Now, that also included medical supplies, important obviously, food. We were running low on food in the country. Building materials. People don't think about building materials being important, but the damage is going on all around the country. Of course, it needs to be fixed. So all those are valid targets for the Germans. And to take it out, they bombed the city heavily.
St Luke's Church wasn't the only victim of the May Blitz incendiary bombs. On the night of the 3rd, the SS Malakand, an ammunition ship bound for the Middle East, was also bombed.
So a barrage balloon came down and landed on the deck, caught fire, and that caused the fire to spread to the ship as well. Well, firefighters were on the case straight away, trying to put this fire out. You can imagine the panic if this thing goes up.
Yeah, gosh.
It's burning all night. Unfortunately, 7:30 in the morning, the ship exploded. 1,000 tons of bombs goes off in one go. It completely devastated the area. It flattened buildings all the way around.
Such was the power of the explosion that parts of the Malakand were found over 2 miles away. The Huskisson dock was destroyed, setting back the war effort, but remarkably, there were only 4 fatalities. How many people were killed overall throughout the Blitz of Liverpool?
Throughout the Blitz, 4,000, around 4,000, maybe more. Similar sort of numbers were severely injured.
God, it's a lot, isn't it?
Some of the high explosives they used were set on timing. I mean, we've got, like, in some cases, 1,000-pound bombs that just crash to the ground and land there, sitting there, looking like the duds. But they had timed fuses in them. The timers were set to go off from anything up to 80 hours after the bomb had landed on the ground.
Wow. Then how does the city process that sort of loss? I mean, what do you do?
Just get on with it. I mean, I don't think people had any other choice.
Yeah. You know, you think of the armed forces, and we're trained and geared up to deal with conflict and the horrors of war, but it's total war, and it's really ghastly when it's taken to civilian population of people who are just minding their own business and didn't want anything to do with this.
Absolutely. I mean, for us now, it's difficult to imagine what it must have been like.
Yeah.
We can try and put ourselves in people's shoes, but it's absolutely impossible. There's no way we could do it.
Days after the bombing finished, the Prime Minister Winston Churchill visited Liverpool to survey the damage. He described Liverpudlians as an unconquered people in the face of the relentless bombing. The German air raids between 1940 and 1942 caused death and destruction in the northwest on both sides of the Mersey. But the people of Bootle, Birkenhead and Liverpool bounced back, and they were about to play a decisive role in the Battle of the Atlantic. I'm in the northwest of England, and so far my walk has revealed how Liverpool's maritime importance made it a prime target for Germany's bombers.
During the war, these waters were critical to Britain's survival. Every week, hundreds of ships would arrive and offload thousands of tons of supplies that we so desperately needed.
But it wasn't all plain sailing. Hidden under the water, just off the coast, were the infamous U-boats.
They hunted in packs, submerged beneath the waves, moving amongst Allied ships and sinking them almost at will. They were Hitler's trump card during the Battle of the Atlantic, which was the only battle that lasted the entire duration of the war, and the Allies were losing thousands of ships to them. Something had to be done, and done fast.
In the early days of the war, the U-boats had only a modicum of success. But everything changed when France fell in 1940. Suddenly, rather than having to sail around Scotland to reach the Atlantic, the Nazis had direct access. They sank so many ships that the U-boat captains began calling it the Happy Time.
And around this time, Churchill ordered the command centre that dealt with the U-boat menace to move out of Plymouth immediately. Obviously, he felt that they were too vulnerable down there on the south coast. So where would they move to? Well, actually, they came here, right to the centre of Liverpool.
Just a mile from St Luke's Church, and hidden beneath this unassuming office block, is a secret concrete bunker that became known as the Fortress. Dave Roberts knows all 55,000 square feet of it.
So Dave, what is this place?
So we're standing in the Admiral's office, the Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches Command.
What are the Western Approaches?
Western Approaches actually means an area of sea, and it's everything to the west of Britain, from the north of Scotland down to Cornwall, out to about the mid-Atlantic. And anything that happens in there is the responsibility of Western Approaches. This building was responsible for making sure convoys were safe across the Atlantic, both directions. And the Commander-in-Chief here commanded anything that was in that area, be it aircraft, submarines, merchant ships, or Allied Navy vessels.
Why is it necessary to have a command centre for the escort vessels?
So Britain had introduced a convoy system whereby you group merchant ships together, and that proved to be the safest way of getting ships across the Atlantic. But the German submarines, the U-boats, are very effective at sinking those merchantmen. So you need to be able to coordinate those convoys, the naval escorts that are going to protect them, the Navy ships that are going to sink the U-boats, and the aircraft that are going to provide cover protection as well.
How much of a menace did the U-boats pose?
Certainly in the early days, up until early 1943, they are a huge menace. I mean, they're sinking more tons of shipping than the Allies can replace. And, you know, supplies in Britain of food and oil and so on begin to run almost dangerously low. There's a real concern in the government that, you know, we are losing this.
How exactly did it work here? How did they command the ships, vessels and things that were all the way out over the Atlantic?
To be able to get the convoys across safely and to hunt the U-boats, you need information, you need intelligence. So every morning there would be a conference call from here to the Operational Intelligence Centre in the Admiralty in London. And they're the latest information from the code breakers at Bletchley Park and other intelligence would be passed to Western approaches. And they then would be able to identify where U-boats were suspected of being. And their job then was to direct convoys around those spots, around those U-boats, to try and avoid them sinking. Later on, it was also about directing warships to those places to sink the U-boats.
How many people worked here?
Roughly, we think in the region of about 1,000.
That's a lot of people,
Yeah.
isn't it?
What you've got to remember is 80% of the people working here are young women, you know, and it's the first time they've ever really had a chance to do anything. And these are 17, 18, 19-year-old girls who've away from home for the first time, doing their bit for their country.
The fortress was also home to WATU, the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, a training school for Allied naval officers. One of WATU's top trainers was a teenage Wren called Janet Okel.
Max Horton, he's a experienced First World War submarine commander. When he had to go at the WATU War Games, must have won every single one of them, surely.
Being a submariner, you're right, he decides, no, I'm going to take on the role of a German U-boat commander, so I'm going to play the submarine. Fine. So young Wren, Janet Okel, she's put in charge of the escort vessels that are trying to sink the Admiral. And on several occasions, she sinks him. And Max Horton, at the end of it, demands to know who this naval officer is who's managed to hunt him down and sink him, and is presented with this 19-year-old Wren who's standing there rather sheepishly looking at this rather gruff Admiral. But it did convince him that WATU was a major part of what he needed to win. I think once it had proved its worth and these tactics had been shown to be successful, you know, over 5,000 Allied naval officers went through this training course, including His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. He spent a week here on the course. Yeah.
Gosh. Did this place actually have an impact on the overall success of the convoys?
I don't think there's any argument that without the success that happened here in Western Approaches, the war either would have gone on for a lot longer or we would have had to come to some sort of agreement, armistice with the Axis powers. Winston Churchill himself refers to the fact that the only thing he really ever feared was the U-boats. So this was really why everything else could happen. So without the success in the Atlantic, there would have been no Operation Torch, there would have been no invasion of Italy, there would have been no invasion of Normandy. It was such a vital part of the whole of the Allied war effort. And if what had gone on here had not been successful, then the rest of that war effort couldn't have been successful either.
Whilst Western Approaches had a concrete fortress to protect them, the rest of Liverpool's population weren't so lucky. The Liverpool Blitz lasted 14 months, and with the constant bombing and the danger that brought, the people of Liverpool needed to find shelter. Poorer Liverpudlians were forced to use public shelters. Unlike London's deep-level bunkers dug 1,000 feet down, Liverpool's shelters were often built from brick, right in the middle of the street. They would have been all over the city, including the high-risk dock areas near Henry Street, and they were notoriously crowded, often smelly and rat-infested.
They could be deadly places to be as well. On the night of the 29th of November 1940, 300 people were packed into a shelter on Durning Road, which took a direct hit. Now, as the shelter collapsed, several people were killed straight away, but the most tragic aspect of this story is that the shelter's heating system was ruptured and boiling water and gas poured in. In total, 166 men, women and children lost their lives.
Money made all the difference to how you experienced the bombing. Liverpool's wealthy lived in houses on the outskirts of the city. Often with large gardens, they were provided with private bomb shelters by the government. Most of these were removed after the war, but in 2019, one was discovered here in Liverpool by local history enthusiast Kyle May.
First time I came to visit my girlfriend before I was living here, we were sitting having tacos on the bench outside, And I'm a bit of a history buff, as it was, and I was thinking, big old garden like this, you know, they often had little World War II shelters, that kind of thing. And I saw this kind of area there, which looked a bit, you know, a bit overgrown, a bit weird, and I thought, oh, take a wander around the garden, have a look. Sort of wandered over here and saw like a sort of like concrete plinth, like a bit of stone sticking out. And I get a little bit of an adrenaline rush when you think you're seeing something new or you found something historic. And pulled away all this ivy and stuff here by the trees, and saw sort of like an arch going over. And you know, my hopes were getting up. And after pulling back all the rubbish that accumulated over the years, you see a little slope down. And at the bottom of the slope, a little hole, which looked like a doorway. And that was when I thought, okay, this must be some kind of Anderson shelter.
Anderson shelters were provided by the government to people with gardens. Those who could afford it were charged £7, or around £450 in today's money. Otherwise, they were free. Over the course of the war, 3.6 million homes across the country built these shelters, but Kyle's is one of only 13 that we currently know of in their original location.
So what I'm sitting in here is basically a sort of concrete box with a lovely galvanised steel roof, and then on top of that galvanised steel roof is another 5 or 6 inches of concrete at least protecting me, and it basically gives me a sort of insulated cocoon underground. I don't know how thick the floor is, but I imagine it's quite substantial. You would basically dig a trench in your garden, and the more energy you had, the deeper you dug, the safer you'd be. And then people would cover them over, and that was basically it. It was just a very basic steel, but extremely tough. I mean, this is absolutely rock solid. This has been here for 80, 90 years, and it's still absolutely rock solid. So it was a tough little thing. It's also got a blast pen when you come in, which would protect the people inside further from any bomb that hit the house or anything. It wouldn't withstand a direct hit. I think they were never designed to, but they were designed so that a bomb could fall 10 metres away, destroy the house, and the people in here would be fine. The downside of that is that you're in a very small, damp, dark space. It's not particularly pleasant. There were no creature comforts, although there's the hole in the floor here, I think could have put like a tin with a sort of little paraffin lamp or something in there. That might have been to stop it falling over. Obviously you've got no running water, no electricity, anything like that. If you needed the bathroom during an air raid, I think you would have either held it in or you would have rushed outside and hoped for the best. A lot of the normal Anderson shelters had a little set of bunks, but I don't see any evidence of that in this one. I see this wooden bench, which is probably original. There's no sign that there was ever benches along the walls or anything, so I don't know, maybe the family brought chairs in, maybe they had some loose furniture. As much as this may not look comfortable sitting here, surrounded by spiders and damp and cold, it's kind of a luxury experience. You've got a beautiful big garden, and you've got comparatively large, safe space to live out probably some of the scariest moments of your life.
I'm in the northwest of England, exploring the remnants of wartime Britain, and I've been discovering the devastating effects of the German raids on Liverpool's residents and infrastructure.
Tons of bombs were dropped. And yeah, look, if you look around, you can clearly see scars today. Look at the side of this building here. The bomb must have gone off right where I am, because look at the spatter on the side. You can see where all the shrapnel's just, high explosives, just boosh.
Just 200 metres from Henry Street lies a neighbourhood that didn't just have to deal with Germany's bombers, but faced homegrown injustice too: Liverpool's Chinese community.
This is Pitt Street. Now, the reason that I brought you here is twofold, really. One, because during the start of the 1940s, it would have looked very different to how it does today. There would have been high, beautiful Victorian buildings, cobbled roads, and it would have been bustling with thousands of Chinese merchant seamen who had made Pitt Street their home. But secondly, during the Second World War, because of our proximity to the docks here, it was completely flattened by German bombing.
Liverpool's Chinese community traces its origins back to the days when Liverpool was a gateway to the British Empire. During the Second World War, the community boomed as 20,000 Chinese seamen were recruited to assist with the war effort. They settled around Chinatown's Pitt Street, and some started families with local Liverpudlians, like Yvonne Foley's father, who came from Shanghai to serve in the Merchant Navy.
How come so many Chinese men found themselves in the British Merchant Navy?
They were recruited and they replaced, if you like, all the British servicemen that were serving in perhaps the Royal Navy as well, or serving in the army. So men were needed, and the Chinese have always been a good source of workers. So they were hired and came in. They came in on, for the most part, on 2-year contracts.
Do we know roughly what the Chinese and Cantonese did during the war on the merchant vessels?
Yeah, the Cantonese were deckhands, so they did all the relevant work that was there, and chefs and stuff. And the Shanghai men were mostly in the engineering department. I mean, my own father had trained as an engineer.
Right.
So they were the ones down below deck, and when things happened, if the ship got attacked, they suffered because they were on the Atlantic run. So a lot of them lost their lives. A lot of them were manning ships and guns, you know. Yeah. I mean, this city owes their lives to the merchant seamen of every race, because they brought in the food and you know, provided us with all the necessary things during the war.
Whilst on shore leave, many of the seamen found lodgings in Chinatown's Pitt Street, but the old Victorian houses were severely overcrowded.
Every room was taken up, and in those rooms sometimes there'd be 6. They're only supposed to have 4 in bunk beds.
Right.
But the boarding house keepers got round it, so if the health inspector came, they took a level down, and it only became 4. And one of the tragedies when the severe bombing took place in this area in particular, it was practically obliterated.
Yeah, gosh.
Now, the problem being they never knew how many, because
right.
nobody kept records of the seamen that were in the houses. You know, it was just take their money and they lived there.
When the war ended, despite their huge contribution towards Allied victory, hundreds of Chinese seamen were quickly deported by the government, and many of their British families weren't even told.
Do you know much about the story of your father?
Little bits and pieces I can count on the hands, because it was a painful thing. Most of the women, and a lot of them passed away without even knowing. They all thought they'd been deserted, and my mother was one of them. Well, they didn't tell the married men that they could stay, and they could have done, but they didn't tell them. And there was a lot of them that were legally married that could have stayed, and they had families, well-established relationships.
Gosh, that's tragic. It really is heartbreaking, actually, to think of the blokes that would have had families here, kids that were legitimately allowed to stay. Yeah. But it's like, hang on, I've got kids, I've got a wife back at home.
If I'm going to be truthful, it was a product of the time. I'm not calling it racist or anything else, but it wasn't a nice situation. I mean, that period we're looking at, different attitudes, different approaches.
In 2000, this arch was opened to celebrate Liverpool's Chinese community. Crafted by tradesmen from Shanghai, it's the largest of its kind in Europe and boasts 200 hand-carved dragons, 18 of which are pregnant, to symbolise good fortune between Liverpool and Shanghai.
The story of Chinese merchantmen here in Liverpool during the Second World War is a really ugly one. Obviously, there were prejudices towards ethnic minorities during the 1940s, but that was compounded by the fact we were at war. But it's a paradox, because we needed everybody we could get our hands on to help us just survive. And then when it comes to the end of the war, there's this deportation of them, sending them back to China. They'd married, they'd had kids, and they deserved to live here. They'd helped us win the war. It's very, very sad. But importantly, it's a story that we must never forget.
Over the course of the war, 4,500 homes were destroyed in Liverpool, and over 16,000 were badly damaged. What Liverpool did with the mountains of rubble is fascinating, and it can still be seen when you travel 5 miles north of Liverpool along Crosby's shoreline.
Wow, this is incredible. People in Liverpool said that if I travelled to the north of Crosby and came out to the beach, I'd be in for quite a sight. All of these red bricks once made up the buildings, houses, homes, offices, churches of the people that lived through the Blitz. It just blows your mind. It stretches for a mile up the beach. And when the Germans bombed Liverpool, well, you think to yourself, why didn't they just clean off the bricks and reuse them? But they didn't have the time. They had nothing left. They had to rebuild from scratch. And what are you going to do with the ruins? Well, dump them on a beach, turn them into a sea barrier, sea defence up here. This is the legacy of the Liverpool Blitz. This is Liverpool.
This rubble stretches for over 2 miles along this coastline. And what we can see here is just what the sea has revealed. No one really knows how deep the rubble goes.
So I've been doing a little bit of scratching, digging around, and I found these bits of what look like pottery. Might be the top of an oil lamp, the base of a jug, or something like that. And this is probably the closest I'll be able to get to the people of the Blitz in Liverpool. And when you think about it, this piece of plate fragment here, it could have been somebody's plate that they were having their dinner from just hours before the German bombers turned up overhead. And these broken remnants, well, they might have been broken as they fell off the truck to be dumped on the beach here, but they also might have been broken by German bombs.
My journey is taking me up the coast to Blackpool, Britain's favourite seaside resort. But despite being only 45 minutes from Liverpool, it was experiencing a very different war.
Wartime visitors to Blackpool would have experienced much the same as you do today, a mecca of entertainment and escapism.
When the war broke out, the nation was divided into areas considered safe from bombings, those at high risk, and those that were a bit of both. This part of Lancashire's coast was deemed safe.
Nowhere benefited from the belief that it was safe from German bombers and out of range more so than Blackpool. And because of that reason, people flocked here in their thousands. They'd come here and spend their leave. Even if it was just a few hours, it meant that they could escape the drudgery of war. Blackpool represented a glimmer of light.
The heart of Blackpool is the Golden Mile, a stretch of promenade between the North and South Piers that would have been bustling with amusements, arcades, donkey rides and fortune tellers. I've come down here to meet Emma Hesselwood, an expert on Blackpool's wartime history.
So Emma, what was Blackpool like during the war?
The population of Blackpool exploded during the Second World War. Blackpool was ideally placed with its lots of accommodation and lots of buildings that could be sort of turned over for war work. There was a huge influx of airmen. About 750,000 airmen did their training in Blackpool. There were also Blackpool's Winter Gardens became a school for radio controllers, so it was known as the Morse Code School. And the whole of the Olympia, which was a big sort of like amusement area where they would have indoor amusements, was turned over as a Morse Code school.
As well as the airmen and radio operators who were stationed in Blackpool, the British government requisitioned Blackpool's large hotels, like the Imperial, and relocated entire Whitehall departments away from London's bombing. And when not working, they all wanted to be entertained.
For all the people that came here, what sort of entertainments could they find?
First of all, you had the Tower Circus, which is the tower here behind us. The Tower Circus hasn't missed a season since 1894, and the full circus programme was on offer throughout the war, with great performers like Charlie Caroli, the famous circus clown, and acrobats and jugglers and all sorts of people like that. As well as the circus, Blackpool was very famous for its summer variety shows. There were variety theatres and shows, one on every pier. So you've got North Pier, Central Pier and South Pier. All of them had shows with a mixture of acts, but usually had a comedian as the main sort of performer.
Are there any famous names that we'll know today that sort of cut their teeth here during the wartime?
Morecambe and Wise. They actually performed separately in a show called Youth Takes the Bow in a beautiful theatre that used to stand here on the promenade called the Palace Theatre of Varieties. Eric was a variety entertainer and Ernie was known as a bit of a song and dance man, and they met touring in this touring variety show. Eric's mum suggested that they join forces and become a double act. They performed in Blackpool in terms of stage shows over 2,500 times, and there is a fantastic statue of Eric and Ernie in the Winter Gardens to commemorate their time in Blackpool. So I can't talk about the Second World War without talking about Eric and Ernie.
I knew Morecambe and Wise go back a very long way, but I had no idea that they started back in World War II.
It's how it began.
As well as the circus acts and comedians, servicemen and women flocked to Blackpool for its glamorous ballrooms like the Palace, the Winter Gardens and the Empress, as well as other extravagant surroundings that allowed them to forget the horrors of war and maybe even meet a partner.
Was it all sort of fun and games here in Blackpool, or did the sort of war cast a shadow over even this illuminated town?
Well, it was definitely, it wasn't business as usual. The war did change things. It had to prepare for bombing raids. As I say, they invested huge amounts of money in building air raid shelters. They bricked up the promenade arcades along the front. They also switched off the illuminations and obviously the lights on the tower. So Blackpool did go dark during the war. The illuminations were turned off for the whole of the war and didn't actually return until 1947. And also there was still a risk of bombing raids, and there were bombs that fell on Blackpool. Terrible incident on Seed Street where a number of Blackpool people died when their homes were destroyed. And also there were a number of air crashes because the sheer number of airmen who were doing their training in Blackpool at Squires Gate meant there was obviously a risk of accidents, and unfortunately there were accidents.
So is it fair to say then that the Second World War is remembered as quite a significant period in Blackpool's history?
I'd say yes, it is, because of the role that Blackpool played. I think the town is incredibly proud of its role, you know, supporting the war effort with the training of airmen and housing civil servants, and of course the legacy of that period in terms of entertainment. I really did cement Blackpool's position as an entertainment capital of Britain, if not the world.
Learning about Blackpool's been really great, actually. You can only imagine how refreshing it must have been for people, say, coming up from Liverpool, having been bombed, to just let their hair down, even if it's just for a few hours. It's raising their spirits, and we all know how important that can be.
On this walk, I've seen how the horrors of wartime Liverpool melt away as you travel north through Lancashire. Here in Blackpool, despite the people in uniform, it could feel like the war was a million miles away.
And there may be good reason for that, because it's said that Hitler ordered Blackpool to be spared from bombing because he was so enamoured by the attractions in this town. And if Britain was to fall, he wanted to turn it into his own personal playground.
Hitler never got the opportunity to walk down this promenade, but thousands of war-weary visitors did, all heading to the town's biggest draw, the Pleasure Beach.
When war was declared on the 3rd of September 1939, the government put a ban on all amusement, and the Pleasure Beach's season was cut short. They must have had real concerns about what fortune the war would bring, but they needn't have worried, because they bounced back like never before.
During the war, Blackpool Pleasure Beach was the only amusement park allowed to open. All others between Berwick-upon-Tweed and Dorset were shuttered.
Do we have any evidence that perhaps the powers that be wanted Blackpool Pleasure Beach to remain open to help people's morale?
I think the fact that the ban on entertainment lasted less than a week probably tells you all you need to know about that.
Yeah.
But also Blackpool was a massive RAF base for training. So over the period of the war, something like 750,000 RAF personnel were stationed in Blackpool for their training. And so all these people basically needed some entertainment or something to do.
Given that many of the people that helped us fight the war from multinational backgrounds, did your signage reflect that?
There were lots of Polish airmen, and so we had bilingual signs. We had signs put up in both English and Polish around the park. And obviously there's quite a few of our rides that are still operating today that had that signage on them, including things like the flying machines, the ghost train, the Big Dipper. We also had a ride called the Bug. I still don't know today what the Bug translation is in Polish, but it seemed to cause much hilarity with the Polish airmen that came here, and no one actually knows why. I suggest it's probably a rude word.
Probably a swear word or something. We have to find out. Do you think that because of the stresses and strains of being at war, it provided a bit of a tonic for people?
Ultimately, it's the same reason that people come here today. It's really thrilling to go on a roller coaster or a ride and forget about your everyday problems, even if it is a temporary thing for a few hours. I mean, I can imagine going on the Big Dipper, which I still go on today, really enjoy. It's a thrilling ride, nearly 100 years old. You can imagine, if you're going through something as serious and horrible as wartime, to have a couple of hours escape from that and have a thrilling ride is a great thing.
As well as the airmen who flocked here, the Pleasure Beach was also a mecca for factory workers. The Northwest was a vital hub of aircraft production, and Vickers Armstrong had plants near Chester and right across Blackpool, building one of the Allies' most prized assets, the Wellington bomber. The Pleasure Beach turned over their workshops that usually maintained trains to engineer vital components for the Allied aircraft.
I love these old engineering workshops and sheds. The first thing you get is that smell of like oil and transmission fluid. These trains are absolutely beautiful, aren't they? And I've been told too that the use for this shed hasn't changed very much since the Second World War, because during World War II, components for Wellington bombers were created in here and manufactured in here. And it's kind of interesting as well when you think that perhaps those components that were made for the Wellington bombers then went out and did their bit during the Battle of the Atlantic, helping to protect and keep the people of Liverpool safe. And it might have been those people in the city of Liverpool that came up here and actually worked on the aircraft. So everything's connected. And it's really, really interesting. You come to these places and it's fascinating. And you've got to visit them though. You've got to visit the locations and really drill down into the stories and understand what happened.
In total, the Northwest's engineers, including those here at the Pleasure Beach, constructed over 8,000 Wellington bombers. They smashed U-boats and Nazi factories and proved vital to winning the war.
Well, what a fun way to end the journey. Getting a go on the flying machines here at Blackpool Pleasure Beach. Last time I was here, I was actually flying overhead myself. But this is just as fun. Okay, here we go. Take off.
8 attractions that would have been enjoyed during the war are still operating at the Pleasure Beach today, including the world's first ghost train, the Big Dipper, and of course the flying machines, which are the oldest rides in the park.
Obviously, given my connections with aviation, it was only the right thing to do to come on flying machines. Can you imagine how liberating it must have been for all of the people that came and visited Blackpool Pleasure Beach during those dark years of the war? It must have been quite a tonic for them. Here we go then, coming into land. Do you know, I didn't know too much about the Blitz of Liverpool before I started out on this journey, but I've learnt a lot, and I can't help but think just how awful it must have been for their experience in 1941. They would have been met by an almost apocalyptic scene as the city was glowing orange from bombers that were bombing it But Blackpool offered people a little bit of respite. I like to think that the Liverpudlians could have come up here and let their hair down, even if it was just for a few hours. When you compare the roles that the people of Liverpool played and the people of Blackpool played, they were very different to one another. No less important, but very, very different. And it's that camaraderie, it's that teamwork. It's everybody working together, doing their little bit in very different ways that meant that Britain was able to prevail and win against Germany.